All right, welcome to our next part. We're on part 7. I'm sorry I've had something wrong with my throat, and I appreciate you tolerating me. But we're gonna try to get through this. Okay, so we had talked about how Hobart had reported. I think you can see that the chain of custody has been established. Um, Hobart had reported the witness statements from the Conneaut area, and he went back to Painesville, Ohio. The committee had been formed, and that would help finance Hobart's trips as he tried to uncover the true origins of the Book of Mormon. And then John Spalding had talked about after Solomon Spalding's death in 1816 that Spalding, his widow, uh, she she had gone to live with her half brother William Sabine in Onondaga Valley, New York. So Hobart proposed the committee finance his trip to Palmyra, New York, where Joseph Smith lived, and also visit the Spalding widow. October 1833, Hobart sets out on his long trip, visits Conneaut, Ohio again, and probably the purpose was to gather letters from the witnesses, Lake, Wright, and others, to permit him to have a copy of the Spalding manuscript from the widow so that it could be compared to the Book of Mormon. And then after Conneaut, Ohio, and getting the letters, Hobart made the long trip to Palmyra, New York. So in early November 1833, he arrives in Palmyra, New York, and between November 3rd and the 15th, and then November 28th through the December 13th, he collected many affidavits testifying of the poor, questionable character of Smith and his activities. And you can find these in Eberty Howe's book, Mormonism Unveiled. Then between November 15th and November 28th, Hobart went to visit the Spalding widow in Onondaga County. Now, he arrived at the half brother's house and learned she had remarried a Mr. John Davidson of Hartwick, New York in 1819. So the marriage lasted from 1819 to 1830, and Mrs. Matilda Davidson had moved east to Monson, Massachusetts to live with her daughter, Mrs. Matilda McKinstry. And the half brother Sabine also added a letter to give to her after Hobart gave his purpose. Hobart kept traveling on. He arrived in Monson, Massachusetts about November 22nd, 1833. So the daughter, this is her testimony of what she wrote. I believe it was in 1834, which actually 1833. Then a man named Hobart came to my house at Monson to see my mother, who told us that he had been sent by committee to procure the manuscript found, written by the Reverend Solomon Spalding, so as to compare it with the Mormon Bible. He presented a letter to my mother from my uncle William Sabine of Onondaga Valley, in which he requested her to loan this manuscript to Hobart, as he, my uncle, was desirous to uproot, as he expressed it, the Mormon fraud. Hobart represented that he had been a convert to Mormonism but had given it up, and through the manuscript found wished to expose its wickedness. My mother was careful to have me with her in all the conversations she had with Hobart, who spent a day at my house. She did not like his appearance and mistrusted his motives, but having great respect for her brother's wishes and opinions, she reluctantly consented to his request. The old trunk containing the desired manuscript found she had placed in the care of Mr. Jerome Clark of Hartwick's when he came to Monson intending to send for it. On the repeated promise of Hobart to return the manuscript to us, she gave him a letter to Mr. Clark to open the trunk and deliver it to him. So we see there Spalding's widow had placed the writings of Solomon Spalding in a trunk, left at her niece, Mrs. Jerome Clark, in Hartwick, New York. She finally gave permission with letters to let Hobart open the trunk to see what was laid inside. So here he travels from Monson, Massachusetts to Hartwick, New York. And he opens that trunk, probably in great anticipation, right? And discovers one manuscript entitled Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek. Now, whether he also found manuscript found in there, that's debatable. I'll just say that's debatable. Like I said, there's controversy, though, on whether or not Hobart did find manuscript found, but only he gave manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, to E.D. Howe in Painesville, Ohio. Now, before he returned to Ohio, D.B. Hobart must have learned about Rigdon from the widow of Spalding, because Palmer Tucker decided to write a news story about this in December 20th, 1833. He says Dr. P. Hobart of Kirtland, Ohio, who has engaged for some time in different parts of the state, but chiefly in this neighborhood on behalf of his fellow townsmen in the pursuit of facts and information concerning the origin and design of the Book of Mormon, which to the surprise of all in this region who know the character of the leaders in the bungling imposition seems already to have gained multitudes of believers in various parts of the country, requests us to say that he has succeeded in accomplishing the object of his mission, and that an authentic history of the whole affair will shortly be given to the public. The original manuscript of the book was written some 30 years since by a respectable clergyman, now deceased, whose name we are not permitted to give. It was designed to be published as a romance, but the author died soon after it was written, and hence the plan failed. The pretended religious character of the work has been superadded by some more modern hand believed to be a notorious Rigdon. These particulars have been derived by Dr. Hulbert from the widow of the author of the original manuscript. Okay. So I hope you can see what's been going on. So he makes his way back to Ohio, as you can see. Pretty long trip, 12, of course, longer than 12 hours, right? That's by today's standards, traveling standards in a car. December 20th, 1833, Hulbert talks about what he discovered to the committee, and Hulbert holds more public lectures. But unfortunately, he used some words that he probably shouldn't use when he said he came to kill Joseph Smith. But probably what he meant there, of course, was he came to destroy the system of the Mormon faith. So he got in trouble over that statement. So this is what Judge J.C. Dowen said. I heard Dr. P. Hulbert, who had been a Mormon preacher, preach a good sermon and then deliver his first lecture in the Methodist Church in Kirtland, Ohio, on the origin of the Book of Mormon. He said he had been in New York and Pennsylvania and had obtained a copy of Spalding's manuscript found. He read selections from it, then the same from the Book of Mormon. He said the historical part of it was the same as Spalding's manuscript found. He read numerous affidavits from parties in New York and Pennsylvania showing the disreputable character of the Mormon Smith family. Hulbert stayed at my house every 3 or 4 days for as many months. I read all of his manuscript, including Spalding. Now this is what J.C. Dowen had said. Including Spalding's manuscript found, and compared it with the Book of Mormon, the historical part, which is the same as Spalding's manuscript found, which is about the size of the papyrus Joe had with his Egyptian mummies. Now, I found this very interesting because it shows you, did Hulbert actually find another manuscript in that trunk, and he didn't show it to Hal or the widows? It's something, that's a mystery. Hulbert said he would kill Joe Smith. He meant he would kill Mormonism. The Mormons urged me to issue a writ against him. I did as recorded in my docket, December 27, 1833, on complaint of Joseph Smith, warrant returnable to William Holbrook, Esquire, at Painesville, Ohio. He was brought to trial, and over 50 or 15 witnesses were called. The trial lasted several days, and he was bound over to appear at the Court of Common Pleas at Chardon. Hulbert let E.D. Howe of Painesville have his manuscript to publish. I should not be surprised if Howe sold manuscript found to the Mormons. There was all kinds of iniquity practiced at that time. So after being in the Painesville, Ohio area, Hulbert made his way to Conneaut with the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, about December 30th, 1833, which was a few days after Dowen's writ. Hulbert went to speak to the witnesses on where the manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, was the manuscript Spalding wrote. And I find that interesting there because but it is, maybe he wanted to know if this was a handwriting of Spalding, but he didn't show the other manuscript. That's possible. But in another video, we covered that unsigned letter of right, and it's worth repeating that you see that Hulbert went to Wright, showed him the manuscript story, and we see that Aaron Wright said, well, yeah, it is Spalding's handwriting, but that's not the same story that he gave me, which is very interesting. And once again, we see that I'm going to skip this part if you don't mind, because we already went over it. So, like we said, Wright and others told Holbert that Spalding informed him that the unfinished Roman story, the one called Manuscript Story, had been written by him for his own amusement. He switched gears, began writing a different story, given a fictional history of the first settlement of America, went farther back with dates, and writing in the old scripture style in order to appear ancient. And after obtaining the new affidavits from Conway, he returned to the Kirtland area, where he gave remember that the statements were given to Edie Howe, and Edie Howe would include those statements in Mormonism Unveiled. Now, so you can see at the very end here, 1834, the statements are placed in Howe's book, Mormonism Unveiled. Now, we want to look at other witness statements that are gathered later by others. So I think that's very important that we look at that. So let's proceed along. So first we're going to look at Spalding's widow, Matilda Davidson. She wrote this in it was written in the Boston Recorder of 1839. As this book has excited much attention and has been put by a certain new sect in place of the sacred scriptures, I deem it a duty which I owe to the public to state what I know touching its origin. That its claims to a divine origin are wholly unfounded, needs no proof to a mind unperverted by the grossest delusions. That any sane person should rank it higher than any other merely human composition is a matter of the greatest astonishment. Yet it is received as divine by some who dwell in enlightened New England, and even by those who have sustained the character of devoted Christians. Learning recently that Mormonism has found its way into a church in Massachusetts and has impregnated some of its members with its gross delusions, so that excommunication has become unnecessary, I'm determined to delay no longer doing what I can to strip the mask from this monster of sin and to lay open this pit of abominations. Reverend Solomon Spalding, to whom I was united in marriage and early life, was a graduate of Dartmouth College and was distinguished for a lively imagination and a great fondness for history. At the time of our marriage, he resided in Cherry Valley, New York. From this place, we removed to New Salem, Ashtabula County, Ohio, sometimes called Conneaut, as it is situated upon Conneaut Creek. Shortly after our removal to this place, his health sunk. He was laid aside from active labors. In the town of New Salem, there are numerous mounds and forts, supposed by many to be the dilapidated dwellings and fortifications of a race now extinct. These ancient relics arrest the attention of the new settlers and become objects of research for the curious. Numerous implements were found and other articles evincing great skill in the arts. Mr. Spalding, being an educated man and passionately fond of history, took a lively interest in these developments of antiquity. In order to beguile the hours of retirement and furnish employment for his lively imagination, he conceived the idea of giving a historical sketch of this long-lost race. Their extreme antiquity, of course, would lead him to write in the most ancient style, and as the Old Testament is the most ancient book in the world, he imitated its style as nearly as possible. His sole object in writing this historical romance was to amuse himself and his neighbors. This was about the year 1812. Hull's surrender at Detroit occurred near the same time, and I recollect the date well from that circumstance. As he progressed in his narrative, the neighbors would come in from time to time to hear portions read, and a great interest in the work was excited among them. It claimed to have been written by one of the long-lost nation and to have been recovered from the earth, and assumed the title of manuscript found. The neighbors would often inquire how Mr. Spalding progressed in deciphering the manuscript, and when he had sufficient portion prepared, he would inform them, and they would assemble to hear it read. He was enabled from his acquaintance with the classics and ancient history to introduce many singular names, which were particularly noticed by the people and could be easily recognized by them. Mr. Solomon Spalding had a brother, Mr. John Spalding, residing in the place at this time, who was perfectly familiar with this work, and repeatedly heard the whole of it read. From New Salem, we removed to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here Mr. Spalding found an acquaintance and friend in the person of Mr. Patterson, an editor of the newspaper. He exhibited his manuscript to Mr. Patterson, who was very much pleased with it and borrowed it for perusal. He retained it a long time and informed Mr. Spalding that if he would make out a title page and preface, he would publish it and it might be a source of profit. Now, I think she probably is referring to Mr. Robert Patterson, and I think she's mistaken on that, because as we'll see later on, it's Joseph Patterson. This Mr. Spalding refused to do for reasons which I cannot now state. Sidney Rigdon, who has figured on largely in the history of the Mormons, was at this time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson, as is well known in that region. and as Rigdon himself has frequently stated. Here he had ample opportunity to become acquainted with Mr. Spaulding's manuscript and to copy it if he chose. It was a matter of notoriety and interest to all who were connected with the printing establishment. At length, the manuscript was returned to its author, and soon after was removed to Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania, where Mr. Spaulding deceased in 1816. The manuscript then fell into my hands and was carefully preserved. It has frequently been examined by my daughter, Mrs. McKinstry of Monson, Massachusetts, with whom I now reside, and by other friends. And after the Book of Mormon came out, a copy of it was taken to New Salem, the place of Mr. Spaulding's former residence, and the very place where the manuscript found was written. And then, need to be said here, there was a misprint made in the newspaper. A Mormon preacher appointed a meeting there, and the meeting read and repeated copious extracts from the Book of Mormon. Now, that's interesting because that fits with Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith when they visited Conneaut. The historical part was immediately recognized by all the older inhabitants as the identical work of Mr. Spaulding, in which they had been so deeply interested, but years before. Mr. John Spaulding was present, and now she may have been mistaken about this detail here, who was an eminently pious man and recognized it perfectly the work of his brother. He was amazed and afflicted that it should have been perverted to so wicked a purpose. His grief found vent in a flood of tears, and he rose on the spot and expressed to the meeting his deep sorrows and regrets that the writings of his sainted brother should be used for a purpose so vile and shocking. And I think she may have got that mixed up with something. That's possible. The excitement in New Salem became so great that the inhabitants had a meeting and deputed Dr. Felicitas Hobart, one of their number, to repair to this place and to obtain from me the original manuscript of Mr. Spaulding for the purpose of comparing it with the Mormon Bible, to satisfy their own minds and prevent their friends from embracing an error so delusive. This was in the year 1833, actually. Dr. Hobart brought with him an introduction and request for the manuscript signed by Messrs. Henry Lake, Aaron Wright, and others. And that's how we know that Hobart stopped by Conneaut to get letters from them, with all whom I was acquainted, as they were my neighbors when I resided in New Salem. I am sure that nothing would grieve my husband more, were he living, than the use which has been made of his work. The air of antiquity which was thrown about the composition that doubtless suggests the idea of converting it to the purposes of delusion. Thus, an historical romance with the addition of a few pious expressions and extracts from the sacred scriptures has been construed into a new Bible and palmed off upon a company of poor deluded fanatics as divine. I have given the previous brief narration that this work of deep deception and wickedness may be searched to the foundation, and its author exposed the contempt and extraction he so justly deserves. Okay. Now I like to look at a man 30 years later, Joseph Miller, who lived in Amity, Pennsylvania, the place that they moved about 10 miles or so outside of Pittsburgh. He says, when Mr. Spaulding lived in Amity, Pennsylvania, I was well acquainted with him. I was frequently at his house. He kept what was called a tavern. It was understood that he had been a preacher, but his health failed him, and he ceased to preach. I never knew him to preach after he came to Amity. He had in his possession some papers, which he said he had written. He used to read select portions of these papers to amuse us of evenings. These papers were detached sheets of foolscap. He said he wrote the papers as a novel. He called it The Manuscript Found, or The Lost Manuscript Found. He said he wrote it to pass away the time when he was unwell, and after it was written, he thought he would publish it as a novel, as a means to support his family. Some time since, a copy of the Book of Mormon came into my hands. My son read it for me, as I have a nervous shaking of the head that prevents me from reading. I noticed several passages which I recollect having heard Mr. Spaulding read from his manuscript. One passage on page 148 I remember distinctly. He speaks of a battle and says the Amalekites had marked themselves with red on their foreheads to distinguish them from the Nephites. The thought of being marked on the forehead with red was so strange it fixed itself in my memory. This, together with other passages I remember to have heard Mr. Spaulding read from his manuscript. Those who knew Mr. Spaulding will soon all be gone, and I'm among the rest. I write with what I know may become a matter of history, and that may prevent people from being led into Mormonism, that most seductive delusion of the devil. From what I know of Mr. Spaulding's manuscript in the Book of Mormon, I firmly believe that Joseph Smith, by some means, got possession of Mr. Spaulding's manuscript and possibly made some changes in it and called it the Book of Mormon. And then we have Mr. Reddick McKee, and he read the copied article that contained the statement of Miller, and then Reddick McKee decided to submit his statement, which was 2 weeks later. So Reddick McKee says, in the fall of 1814, I arrived in the village of Goodwill, Amity is also called, for 18 to 20 months, sold goods in the store previously occupied by Mr. Thomas Bryce. It was on the main street a few rods west of Spaulding's Tavern, where I was a boarder. With both Mr. Solomon Spaulding and his wife, I was quite intimately acquainted. He was regarded as an amiable, inoffensive, intelligent old gentleman of some 60 winters, and as having been formerly a teacher or professor in some Eastern academy or college, but I was not aware of his having been a preacher or called reverend. He was afflicted with a rupture which made locomotion painful, confined him much to his house. They possessed but little of this world's goods, and as I understood, selected Amity as a residence, because it was a healthy and inexpensive place to live in. I recollect quite well Mr. Spaulding spending much time in writing on sheets of paper torn out of an old book what purported to be a veritable history of the nations or tribes who inhabited Canaan when or before that country was invaded by the Israelites under Joshua. He described with great particularity their numbers, customs, modes of life, their wars, stratagems, victories and defeats, etc. His style was flowing and grammatical, though gaunt and abrupt, very like the story of the Maccabees and other apocryphal books in the old Bibles. He called it Lost History Found, Lost Manuscript, or some such name, not disguising that it was wholly a work of the imagination written to amuse himself, and without any immediate view to publication. I read or heard him read many wonderful and amusing passages from different parts of his professed historical records, and was struck with the minuteness of his details and the apparent truthfulness and sincerity of the author. Defoe's veritable Robinson Crusoe was not more reliable. I have an indistinct recollection of the passage referred to by Mr. Miller about the Amalekites making a cross with red paint on their foreheads to distinguish them from their enemies in the confusion of battle. But the manuscript was full of equally lucrative descriptions. After my removal to Wheeling in 1818, I understood from Dr. Cephas Dodd, perhaps, that Mr. Spaulding had died, and his widow had returned to her friends in northern Ohio or western New York. She would naturally take the manuscript with her. Now it was in northern Ohio, probably in Lake or Ashtabula County, that the first Mormon prophet or impostor, Joe Smith, lived and published what he called the Book of Mormon, or the Mormon Bible. It is quite probable, therefore, that with some alterations, the Book of Mormon was in fact the lost book, or lost history found, of my old landlord, Solomon Spaulding of Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania. I have also a recollection of reading in some newspaper about the time of my removal to California in 1850, and an article on this subject charging Joe Smith directly with purloining or in some improper way getting possession of a certain manuscript which an aged clergyman had written for his own amusement, as a novel, and out of it making up his pretended Mormon Bible. Smith's converts or followers were challenged to deny the statement. Both the date and the name of the paper I have forgotten. Possibly in your own file, the reporter some notice of the matter may be found to verify my recollection. Many changes have occurred in old Catfish's camp as well as Amity since I first knew them. Mr. Joseph Miller, Sr., is, I presume, my old friend, Joe Miller, with whom in 1815 I had many a game of house ball at the east side of Spaulding's Tavern. If so, and this article meets his eye, he will recollect the stripling who sewed tape and other necessaries in the frame house nearly opposite good old Teba Cook's residence in Amity. He was then in the prime of life, always in good humor, told a story well, a good shot with a rifle, and the best ball player in the crowd. When he and I happened to be partners, we were sure to win. I wish him happy days and a green old age. If any of these desultory recollections of the olden time can aid in any way the truth of history and the suppression of a miserable imposture, use them as you deem proper, either in print or in the wastebasket, respectively, Reddick McKee. So I think that's very interesting what is said there, and we will continue these witness statements later. I really appreciate you being with us. We'll be back in a few minutes.